Dr. Hong, for that really lovely introduction. It's very nice to know when people are actually reading your work really closely. And there are many, many people to thank, but this book couldn't have really come to light in the ways that it was able to without the support of this whole group of scholars sitting here at the Loud Collective. And I just want to acknowledge you all and thank you all for your intellectual support and your intellectual solidarity, and for being effective at disagreement. I really appreciate that. It means a lot. And I also want to thank Brenda Johnson-Grau, Kimberly Granholm, Delina McMillan, the Center for the Study of Women, Feminist Studies, the Ralph Bunche Center, African Studies, International Studies, and their participation in the New Directions in Black Feminist Studies project, and the other folks who I didn't mention because I don't know. And I want to especially say thank you for giving me the library space, because I know this is kind of a really precious space for people just to have quiet, so thank you. All right, so I'm going to move between a talk and a PowerPoint that is kind of dense. You know, it's not got a lot of images and stuff, so I apologize for that, but that's how it is. And I will talk through some of the points, not all of them, but the ones that I think are kind of most critical to kind of get at, and then I'll conclude, I'll come back to the text and the talk. So concluding research that was launched in 1984, Fatima Meer's research project, Black Women Workers, Study in Patriarchy and Women Production Workers in South Africa, raised critical questions about how the concept of gendered Black consciousness articulated with racial colonialism, segregation, and apartheid. Like other books published in its time, concerning and documenting what Nomboniso Gasa has called the largely uninterrupted politics of Black working women. And I like that historical frame, to think of it as kind of an enduring history of struggle. You know, the way that, you know, Dr. Bowman talks about, you know, marking my word for hundreds of years of conquest. You know, not like in the 1970s people got on board. This is hundreds and hundreds of years of work. But this particular text resulted from a robust confluence of political activity, autonomous research, and careful attention to the politics of publishing. So Meer founded the Institute for Black Research in 1972, and I'll hit on that again later. But what the Institute for Black Research was in South Africa was a Black consciousness knowledge-making factory. So there are all kinds of people who participated in anti-apartheid politics, mostly based in Durban, South Africa, but who had national connections and international connections. A lot of the people who facilitated and came through that place ended up in exile, but it was an important space, sometimes founded by the Ford Foundation, other foundations, but primarily animated by collective research. So you notice in Factory and Family and Black Women Worker and these many places, they'll always include every single name of every researcher. So it'll be 17 people participated as the authors in it. They'll also do things that seem symbolic, but they're actually incredibly grounded. So as they're publishing research, they've conducted question and answer of people in the community, and it's been done in multiple languages. They also publish multiple languages side by side on page, because the idea is that they want it to be rough and ready research that can actually be used by people in communities. Yeah. So that's kind of a quick history of the Institute for Black Research. While the radical Black feminism of that era was becoming coherent as a set of consistent political philosophies across the Americas and on the African continent, I argue that it was anticipating, laying groundwork for, and helping to establish the publishing audience that constitutes our current interest in comparative Black feminist studies. So some of the research that's done now on race, class, and gender in Brazil, race, class, and gender in Colombia, race, class, and gender in South Africa, race, class, and gender in Nigeria, comes out of this kind of moment of research, right? And what I think is kind of most compelling to me about the book being called Black Woman Worker is that they're able to hold the unitariness of this political identity of Black, right? But after every moment in the text where you see Black, they have a parenthetical that says African, Indian, and colored women, right? So they're holding this kind of multiplicity that in other publications I've referred to as Black rainbows. This kind of notion that a Black politics is actually political, right? It's not about phenotype, it's not about identity, it's about how you address violence and who are the sets of strategic alliances that you can be in with so that you can address violence structurally, right? Sometimes it deploys national organization, but most often this Black politics is focused on the local, right? It uses interstitial kinds of organizing. It has a transnational imaginary before we were even using that kind of language of transnational. And as I said, I'll get into that more. Okay, so let's go on to... So I want to open with this provocation from Zine Magubane. She's a sociologist at Boston College, and she wrote in 1997 an agenda article this statement: "We need to understand the ways in which speaking from an essentialized position can be a site of political power as well as a unified set of social and political and historical experiences, not a physiognomy." So when Magubane was writing that, she was trying to address a couple of things, but one of them was the notion that I mean, it's just so funny, like we think of this moment as kind of like the post-racial moment, right? All of a sudden we are now post-racial, when in fact the origins of post-racialism, we could at the very least take them back to the early 1910s, 1920s. Because really what post-racialism is not only like a rejection of liberation movements, but it's an attempt to suppress at a really basic level any kind of radical articulation of what Black people say they need on the planet. Right? That's really what the post-racial is. And typically it takes the form of if you start a Black newspaper or you have a Black press, then somebody else gets kind of recruited to start an alternate Black press that's more liberal, that's more willing to address whatever dominant power, whatever white minority rule argues is the best thing that should be addressed, right? So it's a replacement project, right? It's a set of complex replacements. So Magubane is not the first one to talk about essentialism or strategic essentialism or kind of identity as a basis for politics. You know, we know that, right? There are many, many other struggles and liberation fights where that gets launched or pulled together. But what I think is really lovely about what Magubane does in the context of the South African movement is it's kind of like she knows in advance that the liberation movement is going to be regarded as being more flawed and more broken than good, right? So the very same liberation movement that actually successfully ended apartheid is going to be regarded by most people as failed, and largely failed because it's too Black, too political, too historical, and not focused on age, other kinds of politically salient identities and forms of power relations, right? It's not focused on age, it's not focused on migration, it's not focused on refugee status, it's not focused on health status, it certainly is not focused on gender, it's not focused on sexual violence, and in fact it is, right? Because it's so locally oriented. So I'm going to try to demonstrate how that functioned in Black women workers' body of research here. Okay, so what are the stakes of, you know, taking this kind of a centralized position? Well, power does in fact operate differently according to different types of social relations, right? And so sometimes some social relations are more salient than others. In some moments in time, you need to organize first and foremost around health status. Other moments in time, you need to organize most around class. It has to do with what's the most immediate kind of suffering. Sometimes you can organize collectively across an intersectional frame, but that's not always given as an opportunity, right? And in the context of apartheid, it wasn't always given as an opportunity. So this essentialized move that's made during the anti-apartheid movement makes the risk of ignoring that Black people might be politicized in different kinds of ways according to different social relations that might be more politically salient for them. And the loss of that, and this is a really, really big loss, is not just that you kind of miss the representativeness of one identity or another, but that you miss the political imaginary and the sets of structures of resistance that each community brings to bear in the conversation. That's actually the real loss, right? What else is a kind of a stake of this essentialized position? And so what I'm trying to talk about is the things that make it a rocky place to stand, right? It's effective, but it's rocky, right? This political identification of kind of thinking about Blackness as a singular kind of agenda item that somehow all of these different groups of people can come together and organize just solely on Blackness And again, I'm not talking about just like Indian, colored, and African. I mean, amongst black people, right? Amongst African people in South Africa. Part of what Magubane is pointing to is that claiming oneself as black was a very effective means to determine whether or not people would experience torture or whether or not they would be able to have access to survival. It really was a demarcating factor, right? Because of this kind of older legacy of post-racialism. And you know, what she writes about is the way that so many black faces are kind of brought out to be the proper representatives of liberalism and of apartheid. People who are seen as socially responsible, people who will be like the right kind of mature, politically responsible people that you would want to be organizing with. And so they are the ones who are granted voice. And so the claiming of blackness and the kind of decolonial work that's done by people who end up being part of the black consciousness movement, Magubane claims is part of how you figure out who gets to live and who gets to die. So the stakes are very, 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 very high. The third thing that's kind of part of the stakes of this essentialized position, and this is something I don't know that we always pay super close attention to, is that the notion of blackness as a politics is not merely something that's only happening in our own moment, right? This is a very, very old set of political strategies, a very, very old set of political principles that we can find as early as conquest, as early as settlement, as early as enslavement. It's actually a process of longue durée. And so rather than overlooking that, I just think it's important to talk about. Okay, so I call these a set of conjuring questions. So what work does putting black in front of a philosophical or political project do? What does it make possible? What does it make impossible? I'm not going to answer that. These are just questions, right? Is blackness, as some people argue, and mostly my colleagues on my campus, is blackness, don't laugh, don't laugh. This is an important claim. This is an important claim. Is blackness incompatible with civil society, citizenship, human being, not human beings, but human being at an ontological level, rights or the social? Why doesn't a discussion of blackness remind us of abolitionist consciousness and emancipation and marronage? I mean, in the contemporary moment, oftentimes blackness doesn't remind us of that because we're thinking about minority sets of politics in California where people have this history of some, I don't know, there's always like, somebody always has in the back of their mind like some mean black woman or some mean black man who told them that they weren't black enough, or who told them that, you know, their sense of discrimination wasn't important enough. And it's funny to me that that person gets to stand in for blackness instead of like Harriet Tubman or I don't know, like somebody else, Fatima Meer. There's other people who could stand in for blackness, right? Why doesn't a discussion about blackness remind us of, this is kind of, you know, a second hand to that question above, why, when we talk about blackness, how come it doesn't remind us of things like experimentation, autonomy, improvisation, and kind of, you know, practices of ongoing revision, right? Instead of a kind of stuckness, a kind of permanency, a kind of unwillingness to move. And they're not a set of, these are not questions I think that are brought to bear often enough, right? Okay, so I call this slide "What Happened Was," and I realize it's probably maybe hard to see, but in the center, the question is, what is the common understanding about black nationalist movements when it comes to gender consciousness? Like, what is kind of the set of common understandings? Well, one, they refuse queer and black sexual politics. Again, this has to do with which stream of black consciousness and which stream of black politics you're thinking of. But this is kind of the hegemonic one. That's that like a theoretical embodiment of the mean black lady or the mean black man or the bad person in, you know, some civil rights organization that was sloppy and unevolved and foolish. Refusing queer and black sexual politics, a willingness to collaborate with heteronormative nationalisms and black heteropatriarchy. Oftentimes this particular vision of black nationalism often wants to explain anti-blackness as a threat to dignity and autonomy, but only means the indignities faced by men, right? And I apologize, I'm not citing in every single box the whole group of scholars who've done this work, But a good person to look to on this particular question is Erica Edwards' book on charisma. Oftentimes, this particular Black nationalist framework confuses masculine representativeness with the entirety of the Black agenda. It encourages dangerous and ageist domestic and reproductive politics. So that's kind of like in the aftermath of Black Lives Matter, all of those Black clergy members who were saying like, well, we really need to focus on Black people killing each other because that's really going to be a self-reliance politics, right? It's ageism, right? They themselves have a fear of the young, right? So they can't distinguish between state violence and violence that's happening in communities and what the origins of it might be. Oftentimes, this particular strand of Black consciousness, it often overlooks its fundamental dependence on Black women's militancy and Black feminist politics. So if you read people like V.P. Franklin, historian of Riverside, he's said for a very long time, following people like Toni Cade Bambara, that there would be no Black political movement without Black feminist articulations of it. That is the tip of the spear, the vanguard, the bottom, the roots, the trunk, the infrastructure, the walls, the bodies, all of it. Yeah. And lastly, this kind of framing of Black nationalist movements, this is kind of why people recoil from putting Black in front of something, right? Prohibits solidarity to protect an institutional juggernaut with backward-looking politics. So it's really concerned with protecting institutions and protecting, we got this, 2 spots at the table with the president of whoever. We got 2 spots at the table. They're trying to protect that. And so they're not actually paying attention to what gets lost when you aren't actually doing the decolonizing work with people in your own community. Okay, so, and now you can't read any of those. They're so small. But it's supposed to be a, I'll go back so you can see the image again. Yeah, it's a martini glass. It's a martini glass. Do you want to see it again? It's so cute. Look.
I know.
So what I'm trying to do here is talk about expanding our basic definition of Black politics in a way that can get beyond that earlier Black nationalist framework as what it means to put Black in front of a political or philosophical project. And ironically, what's so hilarious to me is, and this, I just think it's a trip, because oftentimes the criticisms of this kind of that earlier slide with the wheel of Black nationalist consciousness, most of the time, the criticisms of that are coming from within the most self-critical and revolutionary wings of Black politics. So it's internal self-critique that then gets mobilized by people who are not part of Black communities who want to say that they're not doing anything of any kind of significance. Right? You got that, right? That's kind of a big deal. It's a nice, olive in your martini. Okay. Dirty. Lots of olives. Stuffed with cheese. Black politics, additionally, is contentious, it's mutinous, it's riotous, it's loud, it's ungainly, it's perverse, it's disaffected, and that's just the stuff that's internal. Right? I'm not even talking about the way that you could be perceived as perverse and ungainly and loud outside of the community. Within the community, right? My friend Lester Spence, he's a political scientist at Hopkins, and Lester always says there's just between racial politics and Black politics. Black politics is the stuff that Black people get into inside the community. That stuff is crazy raucous all the time. All the time. And somehow the representation of Black communities is that they're solipsistic and narrow and stagnant and tight and never moving, right? And never moving, right? And the last one, and each of these is, these little olives, I've tried to work out these separate pieces in separate essays. So one of them is a cultural dynamics essay, another one is an essay called Black Rainbows, and another one is called Mammy No More. And the simple idea of Black rainbows in South Africa is to be the rainbow nation. And so what is it? Can it still be a rainbow if it's Black? That's kind of the question I was working through there. But this last one is this question about the willingness to see oneself as Black, right? And so what had to happen politically for Indian women in Durban and colored women in Durban and colored women in the Western Cape to imagine themselves as Black? What had to happen to them, right? What set of, external types of disadvantage, what types of embodied markers of racialized violence. And so, the folks who were part of the Black consciousness movement, who were African, Indian, and colored, speak in great detail in the after-apartheid moment about what happened to them, why Steve Biko and Robert Sobukwe captured their imagination. It had to do with people talking about having naughty hair, right? It had to do with these very embodied kinds of things that were required of them, that were supposed to be legitimations of why they were inferior, and legitimations of if they could tame their hair, their wounds, their skin color, their tone of voice, the way they walked, whether or not they were heavy-footed or light-footed, then somehow they could be legitimate citizens. Somehow they could be, politically active, right? And in the midst of that, in the midst of the state fomenting massive riots among Indian and African people, like literally putting guns in so that hundreds of thousands of people would be killed in 1949, right? In the midst of bannings, imprisonment, in the midst of that, these people claim blackness politically, not because they're naive, not because they're politically immature, not because they're backward, but because they think that there is something powerful about what blackness can signify. Yeah. All right, so if this is kind of like what happened was, this kind of, way that blackness gets scripted, right? Where we end up, I think now, and it's not really a linear trajectory. Because many of the people who are publishing these kind of critiques, you'll see from the dates, they're like right in the same time period as these other folks, right? So I'm kind of doing an artificial before and after. Just bear with me. But there's been a really profound research yield of people who assume that Black consciousness actually coheres with gender consciousness. Whole bunch of scholars. And who are doing it in local and transnational fashion. A huge raft of scholars, right? What do they presume? They presume that blackness is deeply self-critical, that it's polyglot, that it's slippery. I love this quotation from Zinzile Isoko, who's got this book, Urban Black Women and the Politics of Resistance. And she has this wonderful quotation about how in the National Hip Hop Convention, oftentimes there were people who were identifying as black, who were neither, and as black women, who were neither women-born women, who were neither black in a kind of census category kind of way, and yet they insisted on claiming that term. There was something politically significant for them about it. So that it's a kind of assumption of a slippery, intentionally slippery kind of identity, a slippery kind of politics. This research yield has found things like Black consciousness is not the same thing as Black nationalism, and argues that the consciousness is a much more robust category. Further, it points to the ways, and Deo Gore, I think, is one of my favorite scholars for getting to this point, that oftentimes what's dubbed Black nationalism is incredibly internationalist, even amongst people who are activists who never get to actually leave outside of the country of origin, right? Their interlocutors are often people from far beyond their national geographies. And it's particularly internationalist in moments of crisis and high levels of state violence. And it's also most times internationalist because it has a kind of a fundamental dissonance with the civic, right? And with nationalism, right? And I kind of mean nationalism in the kind of white nationalism sense, like with a big N. This approach has yielded scholars who insist over and over again that Black consciousness and activism is multi-scalar. And what that means is that you can measure Black political action in the barbershop, you can measure Black political consciousness raising and this vigorous debate that's central to it in townships. You know, you can measure this in all kinds of places. It doesn't have to be a particular type of institution. to measure. It doesn't have to be the Congress. It doesn't have to be the Congressional Black Caucus. It doesn't have to be the ANC. It doesn't have to be traditional political institutions. And that's kind of what they mean by a multi-scalar activism. Yeah? This kind of research has also yielded Black queer people's deep investments in Black liberation, Black feminists' consistent commitments to Black liberation, cross-generational commitments. And this part is one of the things I love this. Scholars who have come to this subject of what Black consciousness is and have deployed Black masculine identities that are not masculinist, right? So masculine identities that are not intended to create a heteropatriarchy or to reproduce, but actually undermine that. So if you spend some time with C. Riley Snorton's lovely book, Nobody's Supposed to Know, you have I mean, this is like some stuff that really blew me away, right? Snorton is talking about R. Kelly's little web series, and it's all about, it's a really worthy diversion, I promise you. It's about all these people who are trapped in the closet. The web series is called Trapped in the Closet, right? And Snorton argues that, I mean, what a thing for R. Kelly. I mean, he's been accused of sexual abuse and pedophilia, I mean, just all kinds of things, right? What a thing for him to produce something like this that names what people accuse him of, but then talks about all the different kinds of ways that fundamentally Blackness is perverse and queered, right? And so Snorton uses that as a kind of as an example, right? The inherent deviance associated with Black manhood. And this is an important point because that notion of, you know, Black people will be saved if we find a good Black male leader to push everybody forward is totally trumped and undermined by this. Because what you find is the good Black male leader, fine, presenting himself that way and also constantly undercutting it. Constantly undercutting it. You also find that these approaches are deeply concerned about things like publishing and self-publishing. And really easy examples are, you know, Kitchen Table Press, you know, which, you know, Dr. Hong has written about, and there's a number of people in this room, you know, including Dr. Blackwell, who have written about knowledge production in, you know, these self-published small papers that activist organizations have deployed and made. They just made it up, right? Nobody came and gave them a grant. They just made it up. They said, we have knowledge that's alternative to what we're experiencing, and they created something brand new. And they were very serious about publishing as a venue for that. Okay, so if that old version of Black nationalism is on the left, what we might think of this Black consciousness as being able to handle now is scholars who've been able to demonstrate that Black women's militancy operates at the scale of neighborhoods, grassroots organizations, and across national borders. On purpose. On purpose. That it's attentive to everyday transactional politics of the electoral sort, and it's also attentive to the imaginary of politics. It's deeply invested with decolonization, and it's deeply trying to reiterate the Ella Baker kind of model of young people being compelled to problem solve for themselves. Right? On our campus at Irvine, the Black Student Union just issued some demands about it was the beginning of January. And after some 40 days of not being responded to by the chancellor, one of the staff members, after they had a big takeover event, I mean, just in terms of the staging, it was phenomenal, right? And a staff member, I've been there 6 years, I've never seen a staff member stand up and say, this woman stood up in a huge public meeting of hundreds of people and she said, staff and faculty, everybody stand up. We are not doing a good job by our students. We have to protect them. If these children were my children, I would pull them out of this school. And the students came back to us later and said, thank you very much for wanting to protect us, but that actually undermines our leadership. We have to actually do this our way. And we'll tell you when we need your help. Right? So it's kind of stuff that can actually correct itself in process, right? When people are used to or willing to have really contentious debates. And what if when we imagined putting Black on the front of a political project, that's what we imagined? As opposed to that other thing, that little funky cycle of exclusion and prohibition and, you know, yeah. And that's that quote from It's Okay. where she says, as a black female political subjectivity gets reconstructed within each mobilization, we learn about politics from black women who are not always black and black females who are not always women. The polyvocality of black women's political subjectivity is emphasized by illustrating how black women migrate within and between politicized identity discourses to challenge domination at the local level. Black women activists strategically deployed slippery identity to entice young people of color. Okay, so what about this person, Fatima Meer? Fatima Meer was born in 1928, and she passed away in 2010. She was a trained sociologist. Her parents sent her to college. Her father was a migrant from India, from the Gujarati neighborhood. It was not a religious family. They were a very liberal family. But her father understood theology as a site of knowledge, not a site of faith, right? So everyone in their community, he insisted that people would be able to read about all things related to all religions, right? Yeah. Her mother was an orphan. Her mother was a Jewish woman named Rachel, who converted to Islam and changed her name to Amina. So in the course of Fatima Meer's life, she has this incredible complexity and dissonance about what it means to be an Indian South African, what it means to be Muslim, who can take on those identities, who belongs to those communities. In addition to having gone to college and becoming a trained sociologist, prior to that, because of the kind of activism that her family, so this is that cross-generational piece, because of the activism that her family was involved in, she worked at her parents' newspaper, Indian Views, from a small child. She actually wrote for the newspaper from a very, very young age. By the time she was in high school, she was helping to found the student version of the Student Passive Resistance Campaign in the midst of the Indian Passive Resistance Campaign, which was one of the largest passive campaigns of its time, to break the law, do civil disobedience, of its time in Southern Africa. In 1946, she did that. Well, what was the state's response? The state fomented conflict that resulted by 1949 in some of major riots. And these were Afro-Indian riots where, like I said, thousands of people were being killed. And this is all state. This is kind of the state's response. When you figure out how to understand yourself politically, they're going to just press it down. Okay. After doing that in high school and seeing the kind of way that this sectional violence had been mobilized by the apartheid government, she really spent the rest of her life working on whatever kind of support she could do in local communities for black and Indian and colored women. Sometimes in the factory, sometimes in neighborhood associations. They just wanted to actually deal with the racial conflict and the roots of racial conflict. So she worked with a woman named Bertha Mkhize to found the Durban and District Women's Association. She also was part of the Congress Alliance in 1950 and the 1952 Defiance Campaign. She was a founding member of the Federation of South African Women, which led that major 1955 anti-pass campaign to Pretoria. We've all seen these major pictures of thousands of women. The response to her participation in that was, of course, a lot of being followed, chased, hounded, hunted. And what often happens when we're thinking about liberation movements is we think about the poor wife that's been left behind and the husband gets taken away and then the wife has to perform these rituals of, I'm waiting on my husband. The truth of the matter is, I think Fatima Meer was actually probably more dangerous than her husband. She was banned for most of her adult life. She was banned for most of her adult life, and yet she still figured out a way to perform that I am the devoted wife and my husband's been locked up and my son's been locked up. But she taught at the university. She founded this Institute for Black Research, and she did all of this organizing with working class and impoverished people. So when I think about that, the ability to not be demobilized is, I think that's really important. I think it's really, really important. I don't know yet really what it was she did that made it possible for her to move through all these communities and do all this stuff, go through, years of detention of her own, go through years of banning. When I say there's a distinction between detention and banning, detention is like actual jail time and banning is, you're not supposed to be part of political meetings. But she kept writing all through it. She kept teaching all through it, right? So what kind of government? I mean, I don't know. They were after the wrong lady. In 1960, her husband was arrested after the Sharpeville massacre. She did these weekly vigils outside the jail, and right after that, she begins to embrace Black consciousness, which is what we think of as the movement that Steve Biko and Robert Sobukwe and Rampele participate in. She goes in, the son goes into exile for a decade, and then after he returns for a few years in South Africa, he's killed in a bomb. There's a lovely, newer, maybe like 4 or 5 year old collection of Indian South African women's writings. And I love the reaction that I get from my students, particularly my African American students, when they read how many of these women were part of Black consciousness movement and their families were bombed and they were, you know, people were killed in their family and they had to escape. Because they just kind of don't imagine that these other people might be as down for Black folks as they, I don't know. Anyway, okay. It's part of that old, you know, cycle of Black consciousness that what happened was. She established the Timbalishe Tutorial College and Craft Center between 1979 to 1982. She built the Fambili High School for Africans, which immediately had 3,000 African students enroll in it. She founded the Kenya Women's Skills Training Center in 1996. I mean, you could tell this was a person who was deeply, deeply, deeply involved, right? And continued to be involved up until the end of her life. At the end of apartheid ends and most people go into parliament. She doesn't take a parliament job. She prefers to stay in the NGO world, which means she's not going to like have lots of money and all of that and have a chauffeur, but she will get to have an autonomous voice, right? So she's able to do that. In addition, her daughter and her son are activists and continue to be activists. Her daughter works in women's rights activism well into the 90s and publishes a number of books that a newspaper that was called Speak is the work that her daughter really worked on. And Speak was a national newspaper, and they literally would just publish stories from whatever local battles were happening all around the country for Black women. So it's kind of like you can see a trajectory. There's discrimination, there's resistance, the state foments sectional violence, there'll be arrests and imprisonment and bannings, prohibitions on political activity, and publishing, right? One of the things that all of the people who were part of Black consciousness movement talk about is the state had a better archive. They wanted all their poems. They wanted all of their essays. They wanted all of the state has their archive. So when I think about Fatima Meer, I think about somebody who is invested in research as resistance. And I told you about this a little bit, what I mean by this. But being deeply committed to connecting whatever findings you might get in the collaborative consciousness raising project of organizing with other people and turning that into a document that could be transmitted to other people who weren't in your same community. So whether it's the Speak newspaper where women would be learning about what kind of activism was happening in, you know, a part of the country or another part of the world, or whether it's, you know, more formal research products, there's this kind of continuity. The other thing about this person, Fatima Meer, is her deep connection to the Black consciousness movement. This doesn't last, you know, across the history of her life, but she's taken intellectually by this movement that articulates political sight, that says that Black people can lead, that say that Black culture is something that's blessed and beautiful, who challenge the idea that Black people's condition is just something they should apologize for and hang their heads about, who are talking about, if we want to have a truly open society, these are the sets of changes that would have to happen in material conditions, right? These are the kinds of things. People who work on massive conscientization of everyday people all around the country in their communities. I think the closest thing you can think of is maybe the Black arts movement here, right? And it functions differently than like the Black Panther Party or some other kinds of movements, right? Because the Black arts movement folks, you know, would teach you how to play trombone and then they would like walk you home, right? This is a little bit, it's a different register of transmission and of conversations. It's a little bit different register. And I know there's a lot of overlap between them, but I'm trying to really push on what's distinctive here. They engaged in a proliferation of black organizations. You know, they had an organization for students, but they also had an organization for kids who weren't in school, who were out of school, right? Which I think is just kind of pretty insightful. Okay, so what are some of the things that make it possible for this complex community in Durban to all come to think of themselves as black? Part of what the Black Consciousness Movement does for them is enable them to think of themselves as being able to get a handle on the miseducation of black people. So younger folks being able to say, why do our parents refer to us as having naughty hair? Why do we pray with white folks at church, but then they eat inside and then we eat outside on the grass? Right? How do those kind of quotidian types of violence happen? And why don't we think of them as violence? Why do we instead think of them as kind of projects of making ourselves better? They were very invested in self-reliance. And this is something that is common across these communities. They have to be invested in self-reliance because the wages are so low and their quality of housing is so bad, and their access to water and utilities and green space and recreation and pools and all the things that make life wonderful and nice is so low that self-reliance is a critical piece of how they just survive. So there's a commonality in their ability to be self-reliant of necessity, right? And some of the folks in this moment, you know, folks who are looking back on Black consciousness, they're kind of very critical. I find to be a little bit heavy-handed, but they're quite critical of South Africans today and the relationship that they have with the state, which they think of as a kind of too dependent relationship. They believe too much that the state is going to help them. And they say, in our day, if there was no toilet at the kids' school, we would have just sunk a toilet, right? We'd have built a well. Yeah, that's not so helpful. So there are these resonances across these communities that make it possible for them to claim blackness. These careful uses of media, their ability to discern between allies and allies of the skin. Okay, so what actually happens in the black woman worker? And let me see how many more slides. I think I have there's only one more slide. Okay, and then I'll just read like about a page. All right, so in this text they talk about and I just find this to be so captivating. They talk about how the actual most politicized people in Durban, South Africa were not actually women who went to the factories, right? They weren't really allowed to have friends. They had to travel 3 and 4 hours a day to get back and forth to the factories. There was a racial hierarchy and a gender hierarchy in the factories. Really, it wasn't until the 1970s, right? Not very long ago. It wasn't really until the 1970s that black women, meaning African women, actually make the transition out of domestic and agricultural work into factory labor, right? And Indian women, for most of their history, are not actually part of factory labor either. You know, they're a very small percentage. They're kind of in white-collar work from around the 1940s on. And colored women also transition out of factory work pretty early on. So they talk about the moments in time when each one of these groups of women makes it into the workforce. But that's not actually what politicizes them. What politicizes them is having to fight landlords who are arbitrarily raising rents on shacks. What politicizes them is these Indian, African riots. What politicizes them is not having places for their children when they're away at work for 10 hours, and not having schools, and the high levels of malnutrition which still obtain in South Africa, incredibly high levels of malnutrition. You know, mainly just because the state has decided that all factories should be export oriented and not produce enough food for people locally, right? So not produce enough food and pay too low of wages, people are gonna starve. And so she has a couple of things that I think are really, really worth kind of paying attention to. One of them is this insistence that patriarchy has a qualitatively different meaning in different class and ethnic situations. That's something that we're all really familiar with as being kind of an insight in women of color feminism and an insight in black feminism. It shows up, it shows up, it shows up, it shows up again and again. And so in the future work, I know I want to really try to parse out more. But because she's such a social scientist, there's only, I mean, these are like tiny little nuggets. they're tiny little nuggets, you know? It's really kind of more data-driven, right, sociology. She also has this lovely explanation of a study of suicide. And I want to actually just read you what they found here. Have to be able to spell suicide to be able to find it. In a Durban suicide study, and I'm reading from the Black Women Worker, white women were found to have the lowest rate of all race and sex groups, white men the highest. Black women, by contrast, Indian, African, and colored, again, because they always say that whenever they say black women, had higher suicide rates than their male counterparts. The suicide rate is a strong indicator of the level of stress in any group. The sheer contrast in this evidence between black and white women demonstrates their difference and their distance from each other, which in turn militates against a feminist solidarity across the race-class barrier. So there are these moments in the text where you get some powerful insight that's above and beyond the kind of data-drivenness of it. Then she has this language of something that she calls unprotected labor. And it's where she talks about the stigma that's attached to African women. Once African women are pulled out of subsistence labor because they lose their land, so after 1913, what happens is they become kind of intensively viewed as valueless labor. Not just cheap labor, but valueless. So whatever kind of work they go into, that notion of them stays with them. It stays with them. And I really appreciated that, because the characteristic thing about apartheid was that it created categories of protected labor for white workers. So there's these white workers that are protected, particularly white male workers that are protected, and there are these black workers, meaning African women workers in this instance, who are unprotected. So there are some moments in the text where they're able to pull apart the differences between these three groups, and other moments where they're not able to pull them apart, you know, effectively, to really give you a sense of not just their, like, where they placed in a labor hierarchy, but really being able to pull them apart so you can understand what the meaning of that is, like kind of the qualitative meaning of that. Yeah. I was talking to a South African colleague, a scholar, Jane Anna Gordon, from UConn last Friday, and I was telling her I was doing this work on Fatima Meer, and she just said, yeah, it's pretty amazing because, you know, those were all just groups that hated each other and they were just politically expedient and jumping together on the bandwagon. I read it a little bit differently than that. But I mean, I'm not from South Africa, so I always am trying to defer, I don't know why, to people who are from there. Okay, all right, so this is where I'm going to go into my concluding remarks and just kind of lay it down. It's about a page of text. So in the contemporary moment, the way that we understand putting black in front of a political movement or philosophical project, I tend to think of as the way we respond to that is we call it problematic, and, you know, sometimes without consciousness we take up kind of the post-racial way of talking about what it means to put blackness in front of something. So critics of post-racial discourse are often disturbed by the claim that blackness has been deemed irrelevant. So people who think black still has some kind of political salience. And they reject the notion that blackness anywhere in the world, right, or blackness in front or part of a political movement has unleashed a political apparatus that suppresses new social identities and movements. Suppressing calls for racial justice for black people in order to center other forms of dispossession is distinct from studying intersecting historical structures of dispossession that articulate with anti-blackness. Post-racial discourse takes advantage of the fact that black political thought has an established history of self-critique from its revolutionary wings and a dizzying array of improvised survival philosophies. I'm thinking here about writings by Amata Aidoo from Our Sister Killjoy. I mean, that title alone gives you a sense of how unruly, right? The book is called Our Sister Killjoy, Tales from a Black-Eyed Squint. Like, it's not some black woman who's just going along with black politics. But what you get from a title like that is it mobilizes remembrance of practices against chattelization, eviction, and the mute death of our children. These are mutinous, riotous, loud, ungainly, black, and comely types of politics. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. This part is not easy to read. Sometimes, as a black female scholar, if you choose to operate in the conversation around blackness, what you'll be kind of subtly reminded of is people telling you that you don't choose yourself. You're choosing like some black dudes over yourself. So I tried to think about what it means to like choose some black dudes or versus choosing cosmopolitanism. I'm being crude here. I'm sorry. I think you all kind of know what I'm talking about. I mean, a little bit. I guess part of what I'm really invested in this project is why it is that we might marvel at the coming together of Indian, colored, and African women, but not also be able to marvel at the coming together of black women and realize that those are related projects, but they're not exactly the same. And so they do different kinds of work. And is it possible for us to learn how to marvel over both of those and think of both of those as kind of important political projects that do important political work, important decolonizing work? So did putting black in front of the name make it more possible for them to move the world? Is that what the power of blackness, that sign, that semiosis is? To do and be experimental beyond death's grip, knowing that life is not a guarantee? To know that death need not be feared and that we exist in its maw, animated, invisible, chattel, property and redeemed, dead and divine, dreaming, mad, awake, asleep, without sense, rescuing our dead divine selves, or leaving our dead divine selves behind and giving up on the possibility of rescue. Does it matter really if we are alive or dead if we can do what black people do, whoever they might be when they're designated as black people? Does it matter whether we resolve this fake question of whether we are socially alive or socially dead when we have so little control over what each of those, life and death, actually means in terms of power and ending the fear of death? Every tool at our disposal, whether we are alive or dead, becomes a weapon and a resource for the psyche of abolition. And not abolition merely from death, but also abolition from life and the frameworks that chain these two together. At the beginning of February 2015, I sat next to my child's bed and watched him grasp for breath while doctors periodically showed up to say he had plenty of oxygen. I learned in those days that I did not actually know the difference between life and death, because his struggle to live in the hospital and out, it kind of deranged me and made me see that even in his good days, his well is still chained to an approximation of death. Breathing, growing, exchanging CO2 for oxygen was an indicator of him being alive. And I learned there about how I had put on my own oxygen mask so many times. That's the advice they tell women of color: put on your oxygen mask. So many times before at the bedside of the soon-to-be deceased relatives in my life earlier, that I declared in this moment I wouldn't actually put on my oxygen mask. I would just kind of give myself over to not knowing whether or not he would make it home. The arbitrary choice to put on my oxygen mask and not be dead so I could declare others dead is what I'd been taught to do earlier in my life. The rituals of mopping up blood as a child so that I could confirm that my own blood was inside of my walking body bag and not spilt on the basement floor. But what I learned at my son's bedside was to walk away from my sense of control over making life, which I think of as a kind of decolonizing process. So in what religious people like myself call surrender, and in the glorious derangement of fear of death, I saw again that the tether between life and death could not hold me if I stopped pretending that I could unleash life. I could witness the unfolding, and I could pray, and I could ask others to pray. That was what kept me on this side. Text messages, zeros and ones. And a side helping of rage at the doctors who came asking my consent for painful extractions of his bodily fluids to see if his genes had caused him to catch a flu and nearly die. I learned in that instance that putting on my oxygen mask had worked at an earlier moment but could not work any longer. I would let everything that constitutes my life go simply to witness and mourn this and that moment. That was new for me, that kind of witnessing. He would wake from the sedatives they gave him for anxiety and fear of needles and rip out the IVs and kind of gently put his arms in the air and say, "I'm dead," or say, "I'm alive." He was reacting sharply to feeling the effect of sedatives wearing off. And this was after he was awake, allegedly. He would wake and gently lift his arms in the air, and doctors would say, "He looks much better." Me simply playing gospel music on Pandora radio to coax down his heart rate. 187 beats per minute, 179 beats per minute, 167 beats per minute. Each number a placeholder that stood in for 3 hours or 10 hours, willing him back to life. Sitting and watching and witnessing, I think I was watching the rapid healing and reconstitution of his genes and cells. And the doctor who wanted his tissue and DNA samples because they were sure his DNA was a signal of death, but I was watching his DNA manifest life. Not truly in opposition to death, but certainly in a balance with death. His is a High John the Conqueror story, not simply a story of the dead, but death must have its due and price from the living. Perhaps this is what people mean when they put black in the name of their movement. It certainly was what I had in mind when I was chasing away doctors by saying that my son has given enough of his black flesh already. It certainly was what I had in mind, blackness that is, when I said to the main expert on asthma that stating the statistic about black and Puerto Rican people just dying from asthma, after all, has to be conveyed in some other way because black people die more from everything. And either our genes are what is killing us, or our genes are yet another bulwark against death, the signal that we are alive. Is that what putting black in the front of a moment or practice means, knowing whether it is determining life or death? It is a riveting question, but not only because it is so provocative academically, it is a riveting question because the pursuit of our political agenda of proving that we are qualified and alive somehow has only left us with the state murder and death of a black person once a day in North America. And if we added that to the global statistics of black people dying every day, we'd realize we're kind of fucked. I'll just put it really, just put it baldly. Putting black on the front of a politics or a set of philosophies or a set of practices, it's doing some work. I'm not sure if my particular handle on it is the best, but I'm going to keep pressing on that. And whether we think decolonizing our minds is dreaming up allies who say we are black and comely even though they are not black, or whether we think decolonizing our minds is dreaming up allies who say we are black and comely and who say they too are black, we still cannot get out of the way that life and death are tethered to each other. Not in there. Thank you.